When Septimius Severus founded the Severan dynasty, he never imagined that the line would be broken, not by external invasions, but by internal intrigues and palace conspiracies. After the bloody reign of Caracalla came to an abrupt and violent end in 217 CE, the throne of Rome did not pass smoothly to another Severan heir, but instead to a man who was in many ways an outsider. This man was Marcus Opelius Macrinus, better known to history as Emperor His story is both extraordinary and paradoxical, for he was the first Roman emperor who never held senatorial rank, the first equestrian to wear the purple, and a man whose path to power was paved by both cunning and circumstance. His rise, reign, and eventual downfall form one of the brief yet fascinating chapters in the chronicle of imperial Rome. To begin with, one must understand his background, his early career, and how a man of such relatively humble origin found himself entangled in the politics of the Severan court and ultimately propelled into the highest position of authority in the Roman world. Macrinus was born around the year 165 CE in the city of Caesarea in Mauretania, a province of North Africa that lay far from the traditional centers of Roman power. His family background was neither illustrious nor senatorial. Instead, Macrinus belonged to the equestrian order, a class of Roman society ranked below the senators but still wealthy, respectable, and eligible for important administrative roles within the empire. His full name, Marcus Opelius Macrinus, points to Punic or Berber ancestry, which reflected the diverse cultural environment of Roman North Africa. Growing up in Caesarea, Macrinus would have been immersed in a world that blended Roman institutions with local traditions, a provincial upbringing that nevertheless provided opportunities for advancement through education and service. The equestrian class offered ambitious men like Macrinus the possibility of securing careers as administrators, procurators, and officials in the imperial bureaucracy. While senators monopolized the highest offices of the state, the emperors increasingly relied on equestrian officials to handle the sprawling empire's finances, communications, and military logistics. Little is recorded of Macrinus' youth, but he appears to have received a sound education that allowed him to move with ease into legal and administrative circles. His talents were particularly well suited to jurisprudence and financial management, areas in which emperors sought skilled professionals to maintain control of the empire's vast resources. By the early 3rd century, Macrinus had managed to secure positions that brought him closer to the heart of power. His rise was not meteoric but steady, reflecting his competence, adaptability, and the network of connections he likely cultivated within the imperial administration. He became known for his legal expertise, which earned him recognition in the imperial court. The Emperor Septimius Severus, himself a provincial from North Africa, had established a precedent that men from outside Italy could rise to This cultural shift made it less surprising that an equestrian like Macrinus could carve out a successful career, though few would have predicted that he might one day sit on the imperial throne itself. By the reign of Caracalla, Macrinus had risen to a position of considerable importance. He became the Praetorian Prefect. The prefecture of the Praetorian Guard was one of the most powerful positions in the Roman world, second only to the emperor himself. The prefect commanded the emperor's personal guard, controlled access to the emperor, and often oversaw judicial and administrative matters in the capital and the province. Unlike senatorial posts, which rotated annually, the Praetorian prefecture allowed for prolonged influence in close proximity to the emperor. Macrinus shared this office with another official, but his role was particularly significant. His legal mind and administrative ability complemented the military responsibilities of the prefecture. He became, in effect, the right-hand man of Caracalla. Caracalla's reign was notorious for cruelty, erratic behavior, and military obsession. Obsessed with Alexander the Great, Caracalla spent much of his reign campaigning in the provinces, particularly in the east. He cultivated the army with lavish donatives and pay raises, securing their loyalty through generosity rather than respect. For men like Macrinus, serving under Caracalla was both an opportunity and a danger. On the one hand, proximity to power could bring immense wealth and status. On the other hand, Caracalla's Violent temper and paranoia meant that even the highest-ranking officials could be executed at a whim. It was in this environment of suspicion and brutality that Macrinus navigated his role, carefully maintaining the emperor's favor while managing the administrative demands of the empire. The turning point in Macrinus' life came in 217 CE during Caracalla's campaign in Parthia. Caracalla had been pursuing military glory against Rome's eastern rival, attempting to emulate Alexander's conquest by expanding Roman control deep into Mesopotamia. In the spring of that year, while traveling near Carrhae in Mesopotamia, Caracalla was assassinated by a soldier. According to ancient sources, the conspiracy was orchestrated by none other than The exact details remain shrouded in ambiguity, but most accounts suggest that Macrinus, fearing for his own safety, engineered the plot. A prophecy had supposedly reached Caracalla, predicting that Macrinus would become emperor. Given Caracalla's notorious tendency to eliminate perceived threats, this prophecy placed Macrinus in imminent danger. To protect himself, Macrinus either encouraged or directly ordered the murder of the emperor. The assassin, a soldier named Marcellus, struck while Caracalla was relieving himself along the roadside. The emperor's sudden death left the army and empire in a precarious position. In the chaotic hours following Caracalla's assassination, the Roman soldiers found themselves leaderless on hostile ground. The army, fiercely loyal to Caracalla because of his lavish payments, was enraged and confused. Yet Macrinus, as Praetorian Prefect and senior officer, quickly moved to stabilize the situation. He presented himself as the natural successor, stressing his experience, his authority, and his commitment to the army's welfare. The soldiers, reluctant but recognizing the need for continuity, acclaimed Macrinus emperor. Thus, on April 11 to 17 CE, Marcus Opellius, Macrinus became Emperor of Rome, the first man of equestrian rank ever to do so. His rise was unprecedented, breaking the centuries-old tradition that emperors came from the senatorial elite. It was a moment of extraordinary historical significance, signaling both the flexibility and fragility of the imperial system. Macrinus' accession marked a new chapter for the empire, but it also revealed the challenges he would face. He had no dynastic claim to the throne, no family ties to the Severan dynasty that had ruled since 193 CE, and no political base in Rome. His legitimacy rested solely on the support of the army and his ability to maintain stability. For many Romans, especially senators, his elevation was shocking, even offensive. Yet Macrinus was keenly aware of these obstacles and sought to consolidate his rule through careful policies. He initially styled himself as a conservative emperor, one who would restore order and justice after the excesses of He distanced himself from his predecessor's brutality, presenting himself as a man of law, moderation, and reason. At the same time, he knew that the army's loyalty was paramount. Caracalla had won the devotion of the legions through pay raises and indulgence, but such generosity had strained the empire's finances. Macrinus, as a cautious administrator, recognized the unsustainable nature of these policies. However, his attempts to balance fiscal responsibility with military satisfaction would prove to be one of the greatest tests of his short reign. The first major issue Macrinus confronted was the ongoing war with the Parthian Empire. Caracalla had provoked conflict with Parthia, but his death left the campaign incomplete and the army vulnerable. The Parthians, emboldened by the assassination, launched counterattacks. Macrinus, inexperienced in military command, sought to negotiate peace. He offered generous terms, including financial reparations, in exchange for a cessation of hostilities. This pragmatic approach averted disaster in the east, but it came at a cost. Many soldiers, accustomed to Caracalla's aggressive and glory-seeking leadership, viewed Macrinus' peace settlement as a sign of weakness. The settlement required Rome to pay a substantial indemnity, which further strained imperial finances. To the soldiers, it seemed as if Macrinus lacked the martial vigor expected of an emperor. This perception would haunt his reign and erode his support within the legions. Meanwhile, in Rome, the Senate initially welcomed Macrinus' accession. 4 senators who had lived under the unpredictable violence of Caracalla. The rise of a cautious and law-abiding emperor was a relief. Macrinus, eager to win their approval, sought to cultivate senatorial goodwill. He emphasized his respect for senatorial traditions, refrained from arbitrary executions, and attempted to restore dignity to the upper classes. Yet this was not enough to overcome the fundamental problem of legitimacy. Macrinus was not of senatorial stock, and his equestrian background made him an outsider in the eyes of the aristocracy. Moreover, the Severan dynasty still had living relatives, and their existence posed a constant threat to Macrinus's fragile position. Among those relatives was Julia Misa, the sister-in-law of Septimius Severus and the grandmother of two young Severan heirs, Elagabalus and Alexander. Exiled to her estates in Syria by Caracalla, Julia Misa now saw an opportunity to restore her family's position. She began to plot against Macrinus, using her immense wealth and influence to rally support for her grandsons. This conspiracy, though not immediately visible to Macrinus, would soon grow into a formidable challenge that would ultimately end his reign. As Macrinus settled into his role as emperor, he confronted the reality that his reign would be a constant balancing act between military demands, senatorial expectations, and the looming threat of dynastic rivals. His administrative abilities and legal acumen, which had served him well as a prefect, were less effective in the role of emperor. The Roman people, an army, expected not just a capable manager, but a strong leader who could inspire loyalty, embody Roman ideals, and secure military victories. Macrinus, cautious and pragmatic by nature, struggled to project the charisma and decisiveness that his position required. In the months following his accession, these challenges began to crystallize, setting the stage for the dramatic events that would define his short-lived rule.
When Macrinus assumed the purple in April of 217 CE, he stepped into an imperial office unlike any other Roman before him. His background as an equestrian marked him as an outsider. His path to power through assassination branded him as suspect, and his temperament cautious. Administrative and legalistic set him apart from the martial heroes and dynastic heirs who had preceded him. Part 2 of his story explores how he attempted to consolidate power through policy, diplomacy, and governance, yet ultimately stumbled under the combined weight of financial strain, military discontent, and dynastic intrigue. The first and most pressing issue was the war with the Parthian Empire. Caracalla's reckless ambitions had plunged Rome into yet another Eastern conflict. He had provoked the Parthians with deceit and violence, massacring subjects under their protection and planning conquests reminiscent of Alexander the Great's campaigns. But his assassination left the Roman army deep in Mesopotamia, vulnerable to counterattack and uncertain of their new emperor's resolve. The Parthian king, Artabanus IV, seized the opportunity, gathering his forces for a decisive confrontation. Macrinus, unlike Caracalla, was no soldier. His entire career had been in law courts and the imperial bureaucracy. Though he bore the title of Augustus, he lacked the battlefield charisma or experience to inspire men hardened by decades of campaigning. Recognizing his limitations, he initially attempted to resolve the conflict through diplomacy. He sent envoys to Artabanus, offering terms of peace that would restore the status quo. But the Parthians, emboldened by Caracalla's death and eager to avenge the humiliations inflicted upon them, were not inclined to negotiate from weakness. They demanded concessions and reparations. When talks broke down, the inevitable clash came at the Battle of Nisibis in 217 CE. The Roman legions, already weary from Caracalla's forced march and lacking strong leadership, faced the Parthian cavalry and archers in a prolonged and grueling confrontation. The battle raged for several days, with heavy casualties on both sides. Roman discipline held firm, but the absence of Caracalla's aggressive leadership and Macrinus' reluctance to commit decisively left the army battered and demoralized. Eventually, neither side could claim a clear victory. Macrinus, calculating the risks, sued for peace. The terms of the peace were deeply unpopular among the Roman soldiers. Macrinus agreed to pay the Parthians a massive indemnity. Ancient sources suggest as much as 200 million sesterces in exchange for an end to hostilities and the safe withdrawal of Roman troops. Strategically, the settlement preserved Roman holdings and avoided a catastrophic defeat, but it came at an enormous financial and reputational cost. To the legions, who had been conditioned to expect triumph and plunder under Caracalla, the indemnity appeared as humiliation. For the empire's treasury, already strained by Caracalla's lavish military spending, the payment threatened insolvency. Macrinus's financial policies soon became a defining feature of his reign. As a career administrator, he understood the dangers of unchecked spending. Caracalla had famously doubled the pay of the soldiers, raising their annual stipend to unsustainable levels. He had funded his generosity through debasement of the currency and heavy taxation, placing unbearable pressure on the provinces and the imperial treasury. Macrinus, upon becoming emperor, inherited this precarious fiscal situation. His instinct was to restore balance, to cut costs, and to stabilize the empire's finances. Yet his methods alienated the very group upon whom his rule depended, the army. One of his earliest measures was to reverse Caracalla's pay increases. He reduced the salaries of new recruits to their former level, creating a disparity between veterans and fresh soldiers. To those already serving, he cut back on bonuses, donatives, and the perks they had grown accustomed to. In purely economic terms, these measures were sound, but in political terms, they were disastrous. The Roman army was not merely a fighting force, it was the emperor's power base. To tamper with their privileges was to invite mutiny. Soldiers who had adored Caracalla for his largesse now grumbled openly against Macrinus, viewing him as stingy, cowardly, and unworthy of command. At the same time, Macrinus sought to improve the empire's fiscal health by curbing extravagance in the court and administration. He reduced unnecessary expenditures, enforced stricter oversight of provincial governors, and attempted to root out corruption. These efforts, while commendable in principle, won him little gratitude. The Senate, though momentarily pleased to see financial discipline restored, remained skeptical of his legitimacy. Provincial officials resented tighter controls. The populace of Rome, accustomed to free distributions of grain and spectacles, found his moderation dull compared to Caracalla's flamboyance. In trying to govern like a prudent steward, Macrinus appeared weak and uninspiring to a society that valued grandeur and spectacle in its rulers. The Senate's attitude toward Macrinus was ambivalent at best. On one hand, senators despised Caracalla, who had humiliated and murdered many of their peers. Macrinus, by contrast, sought reconciliation. He recalled exiled senators, restored confiscated properties, and attempted to treat the body with respect. He presented himself as a restorer of dignity, a legal-minded ruler who valued tradition. On the other hand, his equestrian origins could not be forgotten. No matter how deferential he was not one of them. To many senators, his accession represented a break in the natural order, an affront to their social supremacy. He was tolerated rather than embraced. The people of Rome, too, had mixed feelings about their new emperor. They knew him less as a figure of charisma than as a shadowy administrator who had risen through bureaucratic channels. He lacked the dynastic aura of the Severans, the military glamour of Caracalla, or the political brilliance of Septimius Severus. His efforts to govern moderately came across as uninspired, his prudence mistaken for timidity. To a public that craved entertainment, largesse, and bold leadership, Macrinus seemed a pale and colorless figure. While Macrinus struggled to win over Rome, a storm was brewing in Syria. The Severan family, though seemingly displaced, had not been extinguished. Julia Misa, the sister of the late Empress Julia Domna and the grandmother of two young Severan heirs, watched events closely from her estates in Emesa. Caracalla's death and Macrinus's accession had left her family sidelined, but she was far from powerless. Immensely wealthy and politically astute, Julia Misa understood the army's discontent with Macrinus and saw in it an opportunity. She began to spread rumors that her grandson, Elagabalus, was the illegitimate son of Caracalla. Whether true or fabricated, the claim resonated with soldiers nostalgic for the generosity of their slain emperor. Julia Masa's fortune was deployed to win the loyalty of the Syrian legions, who began to acclaim Elagabalus as the rightful heir to the Severan dynasty. Macrinus, meanwhile, remained in Antioch, attempting to govern from the east. He underestimated the seriousness of Julia Masa's conspiracy, perhaps believing that his peace with Parthia and his administrative reforms would secure his position. But the seeds of rebellion had been sown, fertilized by discontent in the army and resentment of his financial retrenchment. Part 2 of Macrinus's reign is thus defined by contrasts: diplomacy rather than conquest in Parthia, austerity rather than extravagance in finances, reconciliation rather than domination in senatorial affairs. In each case, his choices were logical, even rational, yet they failed to satisfy the expectations of Rome's military, political, and social constituencies. The paradox of Macrinus is that he governed like a careful steward when what the empire demanded, at least in perception, was a bold leader. His inability to bridge this gap between prudence and charisma would soon bring him face to face with the Severan resurgence that Julia Misa unleashed in the name of her grandson. By the late summer of 217 CE, Macrinus had been on the throne only a few months, yet already his regime was showing cracks. His peace settlement with the Parthians had drained the treasury and insulted the pride of his legions. His financial austerity measures alienated the soldiers who had grown accustomed to Caracalla's largesse. His status as the first equestrian emperor left him vulnerable in the eyes of the Senate and the Roman aristocracy, who saw him as a usurper without pedigree. And while he tried to govern prudently, Rome's populace remained indifferent, if not hostile, to an emperor who lacked the charisma of his Severan predecessors. It was in this climate of fragility that the Severan counter-revolution began. Far from Rome, in the city of Emesa in Syria, Julia Misa quietly set her plans into motion. Misa was the sister of Julia Domna, the widow of Septimius Severus, and the mother of Caracalla and Geta. With the deaths of both Caracalla and Geta, Misa might have seemed relegated to irrelevance. Caracalla had exiled her and her family from court, forcing them back to their Syrian estates. But Misa was not a woman to be sidelined. A shrewd political operator, fabulously wealthy, and deeply embedded in the Syrian aristocracy, she possessed both the means and the will to act. Her grandsons, Elagabalus, then a teenager, known by his priestly name Varius Avitus Bassianus, and Alexander Severus, still a child, represented living connections to the Severan bloodline. Severus had established a dynasty that, for all its flaws, commanded loyalty from the army and provinces alike. Caracalla's soldiers, in particular, had adored him for his generosity and his rough soldierly persona. Many were bitter at his assassination and resented Macrinus, whom they suspected correctly of orchestrating it. Julia Misa shrewdly exploited this nostalgia, crafting a narrative that her grandson Elagabalus was not merely Caracalla's cousin, but his illegitimate son. Whether this claim was true mattered little. In the realm of Roman politics, perception and rumor carried as much weight as fact. To cement this claim, Julia Misa deployed her vast wealth to bribe and reward soldiers stationed near Emesa. She whispered into the ears of legionary officers and centurions that Caracalla's true heir still lived, a boy who embodied both the blood of the Severans and the divine favor of the gods. Elagabalus himself, already serving as a hereditary priest of the sun god Elagabal in Emesa, played his role with remarkable composure. Draped in the rich garments of his priesthood, he seemed to radiate divine approval. Soldiers who saw him were struck by his resemblance to Caracalla, a likeness Misa emphasized relentlessly. Slowly, steadily, the embers of discontent among the legions were fanned into open flames of rebellion. The tipping point came in early 218 CE, less than a year into Macrinus's reign. The 3rd Gallic Legion, stationed at Raphania near Emesa, was the first to declare for Elagabalus. In a carefully staged ceremony, Julia Misa and her daughter Julia Soenius presented the boy to the troops, proclaiming him the son of Caracalla. The legionaries, swayed by money, memory, and hope, lifted him on their shields and acclaimed him emperor. The news spread rapidly across Syria, drawing other units into the rebellion. Julia Misa had ignited a civil war. For Macrinus, stationed in Antioch, the uprising posed a dire threat. At first, he underestimated it. Rebellions in the provinces were not uncommon, and emperors often dealt with them swiftly. But Macrinus failed to grasp the depth of resentment in his own army and the potency of the Severan name. Reports reached him that soldiers were deserting, that Julia Misa was distributing gold, and that Elagabalus's claim was gaining credibility. Rather than confront the threat immediately, Macrinus hesitated. His cautious nature, which had served him well as a bureaucrat, now betrayed him as an emperor. Instead of marching swiftly to crush the rebellion, he delayed, sending envoys to negotiate and dispatching detachments piecemeal. Each delay gave the Severan cause more time to gather strength. Meanwhile, Julia Misa orchestrated her propaganda with masterful precision. She circulated coins bearing Elagabalus's image, staged processions where the boy appeared in splendid priestly attire, and ensured that rumors of divine omens accompanied his every appearance. Soldiers who had once cursed Macrinus' stinginess now hailed the boy emperor as the heir of Caracalla as generosity. The religious aspect of Elagabalus's identity also played a role. As high priest of the sun god, he embodied a fusion of divine and dynastic legitimacy that resonated deeply with Syrian troops. What began as a provincial mutiny swelled into a movement that threatened to engulf the empire. Macrinus, recognizing the danger too late, attempted to reverse course. He promised higher pay to the soldiers, belatedly trying to undo the damage of his earlier austerity. He recalled units loyal to him and prepared for battle. But his offers rang hollow. Soldiers who had already defected to Elagabalus were unlikely to return, and those who remained loyal doubted his resolve. His financial reversals also revealed inconsistency, making him appear weak and desperate. The aura of imperial authority, once tarnished, is difficult to restore. The confrontation between Macrinus and Elagabalus was now inevitable. Both sides gathered their forces in Syria, preparing for a decisive clash. For Macrinus, this was a test he could not afford to lose. For Julia Misa and her grandson, it was an all-or-nothing gamble to restore the Severan dynasty. The fate of Rome hung in the balance, determined not in the Senate of the capital, but on the battlefields of the East. As the armies drew near one another, propaganda intensified. Julia Misa spread the tale that Elagabalus had been seen in dreams alongside Caracalla, blessed by the gods, destined to avenge his father and rule Rome. Macrinus countered with proclamations declaring the rebellion illegitimate, denouncing Julia Misa as a schemer and Elagabalus as a fraud. But words mattered less than loyalty, and loyalty increasingly tilted toward the Severan camp. Part 3 of Macrinus' story is thus a tale of intrigue and counter-intrigue, of how Julia Misa transformed her exile into an opportunity, how she manipulated nostalgia for Caracalla into a dynastic restoration, and how Macrinus' failure to command the hearts of his soldiers left him dangerously exposed. The stage was now set for open war, a struggle between the cautious administrator, who had seized the purple through assassination, and the teenage priest, who claimed divine and dynastic legitimacy. In the months that followed, the empire would witness a battle not just of armies, but of narratives, loyalties, and the very meaning of imperial legitimacy. When Macrinus managed to secure the throne in 217 CE, he inherited not just the glittering trappings of imperial power, but also the burdens and dangers that came with it. His reign, though brief, was characterized by a series of struggles that tested his ability to govern, his resilience in the face of opposition, and his capacity to balance the competing demands of the army, the Senate, and the Roman populace. By the time the third year of his reign dawned, it was clear that Macrinus faced an almost insurmountable task, ruling an empire with fractured loyalties, limited personal legitimacy, and a constant shadow of the Severan dynasty looming over him. The most pressing issue Macrinus encountered was maintaining the loyalty of the Roman legions. His rise to power had depended heavily on the army's dissatisfaction with Caracalla, but once the initial wave of support subsided, the soldiers grew restless. Unlike Caracalla, who lavished wealth and privileges upon them, Macrinus was more frugal, attempting to restore discipline and reduce military expenditures. He sought to curb the excesses of soldiers who had become accustomed to luxurious pay and indulgences, and while his motivations may have stemmed from a genuine concern for the financial stability of the empire, the legions interpreted it as a betrayal. The reduction in donatives and benefits was seen as an insult, especially because many soldiers had expected Macrinus to reward them handsomely for helping him ascend the throne. Tension between the emperor and his soldiers intensified when news spread of Macrinus' peace negotiations with the Parthians. Caracalla had been planning another aggressive eastern campaign before his death, and many in the army relished the opportunity for glory and plunder. Instead, Macrinus sought to end hostilities. He signed a treaty with the Parthian king Elagabalus IV, which required Rome to pay a large indemnity in order to secure peace. Although this move was strategically pragmatic, Rome avoided further losses and stabilized the eastern frontier. It was deeply unpopular among the soldiers, who saw it as humiliating. The legions were left disheartened, and Macrinus' reputation as a weak and indecisive ruler began to spread throughout the empire. The situation was further complicated by the Severan dynasty's lingering influence. Caracalla's mother, Julia Domna, had died shortly after her son's assassination, but the Severan women still commanded respect and wielded significant influence. Julia Misa, the sister of Julia Domna and grandmother of the young boy who would later become Elagabalus, quietly began laying the groundwork for a challenge to Macrinus' rule. She retreated to Emesa in Syria, where she possessed immense wealth and influence among the local population, as well as strong ties to the legions stationed nearby. Julia Misa cleverly exploited the discontent of the soldiers, spreading the rumor that her grandson was in fact the illegitimate son of Caracalla. This claim, though dubious, was powerful in its appeal. The soldiers, nostalgic for Caracalla's generosity and charisma, were easily swayed by the prospect of rallying behind someone who could claim direct lineage to their beloved emperor. While Julia Misa and her allies worked in the shadows, Macrinus tried to strengthen his control over Rome and the provinces. In the capital, the Senate initially welcomed him as emperor. Unlike the Severans, who had often sidelined and humiliated senators, Macrinus extended gestures of reconciliation and respect toward them. He restored some privileges, sought their counsel, and tried to present himself as a traditional ruler in line with senatorial ideals. For a moment, this approach worked, and many senators expressed gratitude for the more restrained and cooperative tone of his leadership. However, the Senate's support alone was not enough to sustain his rule. Without the steadfast backing of the army, Macrinus' position was precarious. His administration also encountered problems in managing finances. The Severan dynasty had left the empire's coffers strained, largely due to Caracalla's extravagant spending on the military. Macrinus attempted to reform the empire's financial practices, but his methods often alienated the very people he needed to appease. Taxation became stricter in some regions, and his austerity measures were unpopular among both soldiers and civilians. Moreover, his lack of aristocratic background and his identity as an equestrian, rather than a senator or noble, made him appear as an outsider. This social stigma contributed to the perception that Macrinus was unworthy of the throne, a perception his enemies eagerly exploited. Meanwhile, Julia Misa's plot gained traction. She began spreading wealth among the legions, buying their loyalty, while her daughter, Julia Soaemius, presented her young son, Elagabalus, as the rightful heir to the Severan dynasty. The boy was paraded in Syrian temples, adorned in priestly robes, and hailed as the son of Caracalla. Soldiers stationed in the east, disillusioned with Macrinus and charmed by the Severan narrative, began defecting. The seeds of rebellion were planted, and it was only a matter of time before they bloomed into open conflict. Macrinus, aware of these developments, attempted to respond with a combination of diplomacy and force. He dispatched envoys to dissuade the mutinous soldiers, promising better rewards and reforms. But his words carried little weight compared to the golden coins and nostalgia offered by Julia Misa's camp. When diplomacy failed, he prepared for military confrontation, though he was hesitant and slow to act. This hesitation allowed his enemies to consolidate their forces and embolden their cause. The climactic moment came when the legions loyal to Julia Misa proclaimed Elagabalus emperor in 218 CE. The declaration sent shockwaves across the empire. For many, it was not simply a rebellion, but a restoration of the Severan dynasty, which still held symbolic power in the hearts of soldiers and citizens alike. Macrinus, recognizing the gravity of the situation, rallied his forces and prepared for battle. The stage was set for a decisive showdown that would determine the fate of his reign. The confrontation took place near Antioch, where Macrinus commanded a sizable army. Despite his preparations, his troops were demoralized and lacked the fierce loyalty that Elagabalus' supporters displayed. The battle was hard fought, but Macrinus' forces gradually faltered. Accounts suggest that Macrinus himself attempted to flee the battlefield, disguising himself in hopes of escaping the chaos. His retreat shattered whatever morale remained among his soldiers, who either surrendered or defected to the enemy. The rebellion had succeeded. Macrinus' fate was sealed. He attempted to escape toward Italy, shedding his imperial garments and traveling in disguise. Yet he was captured near Chalcedon and brought back to the victors. After a brief imprisonment, he was executed, marking a swift and ignoble end to his reign. His young son Diadumenian, whom he had elevated as co-emperor in a desperate bid to secure dynastic continuity, also met a tragic fate. The boy was captured and killed, erasing Macrinus' lineage from the imperial stage. In hindsight, the downfall of Macrinus highlighted the fragility of imperial power when unaccompanied by legitimacy and popular support. Though he attempted to govern with moderation and restore financial stability, his lack of charisma, military generosity, and dynastic connection doomed him. The Severan women, with their cunning use of wealth, lineage, and propaganda, had outmaneuvered him at every turn. His reign, lasting scarcely over a year, became one of the shortest in Roman imperial history. Yet, despite the brevity of his rule, Macrinus' story remains significant for what it reveals about the dynamics of Roman politics. His ascent marked the first time an equestrian, rather than a senator or aristocrat, had become emperor. It underscored the decisive role of the army in elevating and deposing rulers. Moreover, it demonstrated how imperial women, often underestimated by their male contemporaries, could wield extraordinary influence behind the scenes, shaping the very destiny of Rome. Macrinus was not remembered fondly by Roman historians, who often wrote under the influence of Severan propaganda. They depicted him as weak, indecisive, and cowardly. His reputation was tarnished by the dramatic narrative of his downfall and by the contrast with the fiery image of Caracalla, whom many soldiers still admired. Nevertheless, modern historians have reassessed his reign with greater nuance. They recognize the challenges he faced and the rationality behind some of his policies, particularly his attempts to curb military spending and make peace with Rome's eastern rivals. The tragedy of Macrinus lies not just in his violent end, but in the wasted potential of his rule. Had he been able to secure the loyalty of the army and outmaneuver the Severan women, he might have steered Rome toward a more stable and fiscally responsible path. Instead, his failure paved the way for Elagabalus, a ruler whose eccentric and controversial reign would soon plunge the empire into chaos once more. In the broader scope of Roman history, Macrinus serves as a reminder of the delicate balance emperors had to maintain between the competing interests of the army, the Senate, and the imperial family. His downfall illustrates how quickly that balance could collapse, and how fragile the imperial office could be when stripped of legitimacy and trust. Though his time on the throne was fleeting, the story of Macrinus continues to offer valuable insights into the nature of power, ambition, and survival in the Roman Empire. The death of Macrinus in 218 CE did not end with a clean break in Roman politics, but instead opened the door to reflection, propaganda, and reinterpretation that would shape how his memory endured through the centuries. His execution was swift and unceremonious, fitting for an emperor who had spent barely 14 months on the throne. But the political and cultural consequences of his reign reverberated far longer. To understand the aftermath of Macrinus's fall, one must look not only at how his enemies portrayed him, but also at how Roman institutions, his surviving supporters, and later historians grappled with the strange and almost accidental nature of his rule. Macrinus was the first man of equestrian background to sit on the Roman throne, a fact that both defined and doomed his rule. The Roman elite, steeped in centuries of senatorial aristocracy, never truly accepted an emperor who had risen from such comparatively humble origins. Despite his education, administrative experience, and legal expertise, Macrinus carried the stain of being an outsider in the eyes of both the Senate and the army. Once he was dead, this stigma colored every narrative about him. The Senate, which had initially welcomed him for his respectful gestures toward them, quickly distanced itself from his memory when Elagabalus seized power. Senators rushed to flatter the new regime, emphasizing the illegitimacy and weakness of the previous ruler. For the aristocracy, Macrinus became a convenient scapegoat, a ruler whose fall could be blamed on his lack of pedigree and his inability to embody the martial charisma expected of an emperor. In the military sphere, the memory of Macrinus was equally tarnished. Soldiers resented his reduction of their pay and the cancellation of Caracalla's extravagant donatives. His peace treaty with Parthia, though pragmatic, was remembered not as a victory of diplomacy, but as a disgraceful capitulation. In the brutal culture of Roman military pride, nothing was more damning than being seen as weak before foreign enemies. The propaganda spread by Julia Misa and Elagabalus' supporters amplified this sentiment, portraying Macrinus as a coward who abandoned his soldiers on the battlefield at Antioch. Even though accounts differ on the details of his final moments, some say he fled in disguise, others that he attempted to rally troops before fleeing. The enduring image was one of betrayal and incompetence. Soldiers who had once shouted his name as emperor now spoke of him with scorn. But beyond these politically motivated portrayals, Macrinus's reign also had practical legacies. His financial reforms, though unpopular, demonstrated a clear awareness of Rome's dire fiscal situation. Caracalla's reckless spending had left the treasury depleted, and Macrinus sought to correct this by cutting costs and restraining military expenditure. These policies were sensible, even necessary, but they were implemented too quickly and without the charisma or political capital needed to persuade the army to endure sacrifices. In the long term, his measures foreshadowed the constant tension between military demands and fiscal responsibility that would haunt later emperors in the 3rd century. Indeed, one could argue that Macrinus glimpsed the structural problems that were beginning to erode the stability of the empire, but lacked the power and longevity to address them fully. The fate of his family was another piece of the tragedy. His young son, Diadumenian, elevated to co-emperor in a desperate bid to establish legitimacy, was murdered shortly after his father. The elimination of Diadumenian ensured that no surviving heirs of Macrinus could challenge the Severans. This ruthless act erased any chance of a dynastic continuation and reinforced the fragility of imperial succession during this era. In many ways, Diadumenian's short and tragic story encapsulated the hopelessness of Macrinus' project. A boy too young to rule thrust into the heart of Rome's most cutthroat politics and sacrificed to the ambitions of others. After his death, the regime of Elagabalus and Julia Misa undertook a deliberate effort to blacken Macrinus' reputation. Coins bearing his image were melted down or overstruck, statues were destroyed, and inscriptions were altered. This process of symbolic erasure, while not as comprehensive as a formal damnatio memoria, served to delegitimize his memory and elevate the contrast between him and the supposed savior figure of Elagabalus. Ironically, this propaganda campaign also ensured that Macrinus' name survived in historical records, even if in a negative light. For had he been entirely forgotten, the narrative of Severan restoration would have lacked a defeated villain. When examining the literary sources, the hostility toward Macrinus is clear. Cassius Dio, a senator and historian, despised him for his equestrian origins and criticized his lack of aristocratic refinement. The author of the Historia Augusta, writing much later, embellished accounts of his cowardice and painted him as unfit for rule. These depictions, while undoubtedly biased, influenced centuries of understanding about Macrinus. For generations, he was remembered not as a reformer or pragmatist, but as a failed emperor whose reign represented a deviation from Rome's traditional order. Only in modern scholarship have historians begun to reevaluate him with more balance, recognizing both his challenges and his rational, if unpopular, policies. The aftermath of Macrinus' death also offers insight into the growing importance of imperial women in Roman politics. Julia Massa's orchestration of Elagabalus' rise to power demonstrated the decisive role that wealth, lineage, and propaganda could play in imperial succession. The fact that Macrinus, with all the authority of the imperial office, could be so thoroughly outmaneuvered by a widow in Syria underscored the volatility of Roman power dynamics. The Severan women, often underestimated by their male counterparts, had proven themselves to be among the most formidable political players of their time. For the empire itself, the transition from Macrinus to Elagabalus was not just a change of rulers, but a radical shift in style and priorities. Where Macrinus had sought restraint and fiscal prudence, Elagabalus embraced excess, religious innovation, and flamboyant displays of power. The contrast was stark, and it amplified the perception of Macrinus as dull and uninspiring. Yet for all of Elagabalus's eccentricities, his reign would also be short and chaotic, raising the question of whether Rome might have been better served by the quieter, steadier hand of Macrinus had he been allowed to consolidate his rule. Even in the provinces, reactions to Macrinus' fall were mixed. Some communities that had benefited from Caracalla's generosity celebrated the return of the Severan line, while others who valued stability may have lamented the disruption. In legal matters, some of Macrinus' reforms lingered beyond his death, particularly his attempts to streamline certain judicial processes. His background as a jurist and lawyer meant that he approached governance with a keen eye for law, and this influence, though overshadowed by his political failures, left traces in administrative practice. Over time, the memory of Macrinus faded into the broader tapestry of the chaotic 3rd century. His reign became one more episode in a pattern of short-lived emperors, each rising and falling at the whim of soldiers, conspiracies, or foreign threats. The fact that he was not a Severan by blood meant that later dynastic narratives had little incentive to preserve his legacy. By the time of later historians, he was remembered primarily as a footnote between the dramatic reigns of Caracalla and Elagabalus, a transitional figure whose significance lay more in what he symbolized than what he achieved. Yet, when one looks closer, the story of Macrinus is not simply one of failure, but of the impossible odds faced by an emperor who broke the mold. He was an outsider who dared to ascend to Rome's highest office, a lawyer and administrator, thrust into the role of military commander, and a reformer caught between the demands of tradition and the realities of crisis. His reign may have ended in ignominy, but it revealed the deep fractures within the Roman system, the army's overwhelming power, the Senate's diminished authority, the influence of imperial women, and the fragility of legitimacy in an age when bloodline often mattered more than ability. As centuries passed and Rome itself fell, Macrinus's name remained an obscure chapter, but modern historians, freed from the biases of ancient aristocrats, have begun to reconstruct a more nuanced portrait. They see in him a man of ambition and intelligence, undone not by incompetence alone, but by the structural contradictions of his time. His story reminds us that history is often written by the victors, and that even emperors can be reduced to caricatures by the pens of those who hated them. In the end, Macrinus's legacy is one of irony. He sought to bring fiscal responsibility, peace, and legal order to an empire weary of war and extravagance. Yet these very qualities made him appear weak and unworthy in the eyes of those he ruled. He tried to govern not as a tyrant, but as a manager, and Rome, addicted to spectacle and conquest, rejected him. His downfall paved the way for the rise of a boy emperor steeped in religious fervor and excess, whose reign would prove far more destabilizing. Thus, Macrinus' story is not just a tale of personal failure, but a reflection of Rome's own contradictions, an empire that demanded both discipline and indulgence, both stability and spectacle, and often destroyed those who could not provide both at once. The final chapter of Macrinus' story lies not in his brief reign, or even in his violent death, but in the way his memory has been handled across time. Few emperors embody so clearly the gap between intention and outcome, between policy and perception, between what might have been and what was. To complete the portrait of this unusual emperor, we must explore not just the events of his rule, but also how Rome ancient historians and modern scholars came to understand him, and what lessons his career offers about the fragility of power in the Roman world. After his death in 218 CE, Macrinus's memory was quickly overshadowed by the flamboyance of Elagabalus. Where Macrinus had pursued moderation and restraint, Elagabalus turned the empire upside down with religious innovations, scandalous behavior, and eccentric rule. This made Macrinus appear dull by comparison, even irrelevant. Ancient sources, which delighted in drama and sensationalism, had little incentive to dwell on a ruler who had tried to avoid excess. Instead, they painted him in unflattering colors: cowardly, indecisive, weak. Cassius Dio, the senator who lived through these events, was openly hostile to Macrinus, mocking his equestrian origins and his failure to command the loyalty of soldiers. The author of the Historia Augusta, writing long after, embellished this hostility into caricature, transforming Macrinus into a cautionary tale of what happens when an unworthy man reaches too high. Yet the reality was more complex. Macrinus had come to power in the wake of Caracalla's assassination, a moment when the Roman army and empire stood on the edge of instability. He had no dynastic claim, no great military victories to his name, no ancestral prestige to legitimize him. What he did have was legal expertise, administrative skill, and the loyalty of soldiers who wanted immediate relief from Caracalla's heavy hand. In this sense, his rise was accidental, born of circumstance more than destiny. But once in power, Macrinus did not try to outdo his predecessor in cruelty or extravagance. Instead, he sought to bring peace with Parthia, to restore financial stability, and to reconcile with the Senate. These were rational policies, but in Rome's volatile political climate, rationality was not enough. The soldiers despised his austerity, branding him as stingy and ungrateful. The Senate respected his gestures, but did not truly trust him. The people of Rome, distant from his Syrian base of operations, hardly felt his presence. And above all, Julia Misa and the Severan women, masters of wealth and propaganda, worked tirelessly to destroy him. They spun tales of Elagabalus as Caracalla's son, feeding the soldiers' nostalgia and securing loyalty through gold and promises. Macrinus, pragmatic but uninspiring, could not match this potent combination of myth and money. When he fled the battlefield at Antioch, disguised and desperate, he symbolized to many the very image of an emperor unworthy of the purple. His execution was swift, his son's death even swifter, and with them the short-lived experiment of a non-aristocratic emperor ended. Rome returned to the Severan line, and Macrinus was relegated to the margins of history. Coins were destroyed, inscriptions erased, and his name tarnished by propaganda. Unlike more infamous emperors such as Nero or Caligula, whose outrages guaranteed their place in memory, Macrinus faded into obscurity. He was not remembered as a monster, but as a failure, a different kind of damnation. Yet, when we look back across the centuries, his reign takes on a new light. Macrinus was not a tyrant, but a reformer. His peace treaty with Parthia prevented further bloodshed at a time when Rome could ill afford more losses. His financial measures, though unpopular, showed an understanding of the need for restraint after decades of reckless spending. His respect for the Senate suggested a desire to return to older traditions of shared governance. These qualities did not fit the mold of a 3rd century emperor, and therein lay his downfall. Rome in this period demanded spectacle, largesse, and a ruler who could embody both martial might and dynastic legitimacy. Macrinus gave them none of these. The tragedy of his reign lies in the fact that his policies might have borne fruit had he been allowed to rule longer. Given time, the fiscal savings he initiated might have stabilized the treasury. His peace with Parthia might have freed resources for other fronts. His moderation might have curbed the cycle of violence and excess that plagued the Severan dynasty. But Rome did not grant him time. The army's impatience, the Senate's skepticism, and the Severan women's cunning combined to snuff out his rule almost as soon as it began. Modern historians, freed from the biases of ancient aristocrats, have begun to reassess Macrinus with more nuance. They recognize the structural difficulties he faced: an empire addicted to military spending, soldiers who equated legitimacy with generosity, senators who distrusted outsiders, and dynastic rivals who wielded propaganda with deadly skill. In this light, Macrinus appears less as a weakling and more as a tragic figure, an administrator who saw Rome's problems clearly but lacked the means to solve them. His failure was not one of vision but of power. Macrinus also represents a significant milestone in Roman history, the first equestrian to become emperor. This broke centuries of tradition and demonstrated that the imperial office was no longer the exclusive preserve of the senatorial elite. Though his reign was short, it foreshadowed a future in which emperors of humble or provincial origins would rise to power, especially during the crisis-ridden 3rd century. In this sense, Macrinus was ahead of his time, a precursor to later rulers who would emerge from the provinces and the army rather than Rome as aristocratic heart. In cultural memory, however, he never achieved rehabilitation. Later Roman historians preferred to focus on the colorful reign of Elagabalus, whose eccentricities made for more dramatic storytelling. Macrinus, cautious and practical, lacked the scandal that fuels legend. Even when he was mentioned, it was usually in passing, as a transitional figure, a mere interlude between Caracalla and Elagabalus. This neglect may explain why his name is less familiar to casual students of Roman history, despite the significance of his role. But in a way, this obscurity is fitting. Macrinus was not a man who sought to dominate with grandeur or terror. He was a man of law and order, thrust into a position that demanded spectacle and charisma. His reign serves as a reminder that history often forgets the quiet reformers and remembers only the flamboyant or the destructive. Yet for those who look closely, his story is rich with meaning, a case study in the limits of rational governance in a world ruled by perception, propaganda, and power. The lessons of Macrinus's reign extend beyond the Roman world. They speak to the challenges faced by any ruler who seeks to balance reform with tradition. austerity with generosity, peace with pride. They reveal how legitimacy is not only about policies, but about symbols, narratives, and the ability to inspire loyalty. They show how power can be fragile when it lacks roots, and how enemies can exploit even the smallest cracks to bring down those at the top. As we close the story of Macrinus, we see not just a failed emperor, but a man caught in the contradictions of his time. He was both insider and outsider, powerful and powerless, rational and doomed. His life reminds us that history is not only made by the victorious, but also by those who fall, and that even a short reign can illuminate the forces that shape empires. Macrinus's empire lasted little more than a year, but his story endures as a window into the precariousness of Roman power and the human cost of ambition. In the end, the figure of Macrinus stands as a shadow between giants, a forgotten emperor whose reign reveals the fragility of legitimacy in the Roman world. He was not celebrated, nor was he entirely condemned. Instead, he slipped into the quiet margins of history, overshadowed by the chaos of those who came before and after. But in those margins, we find a story worth telling, a story of ambition, reform, betrayal, and downfall, a reminder that even the most forgotten rulers have lessons to teach. His reign, though fleeting, captures the essence of Rome's 3rd century: instability, struggle, and the ever-present tension between order and chaos.